Josh, I hear you went to the Riverside County council meeting today, and it was not a happy time.
Yeah, it's pretty depressing. Not a good outcome. 5-0 vote in favor of breed-specific mandatory spay and neuter for pit bulls for Riverside County.
Well, as you and I talked earlier, I always say to people, when you come out of one of these meetings, that you shouldn't feel like you failed as an advocate. Some people are open to discussions, others aren't. Clearly, they had made their minds up before this happened, and they were listening. And they had all the information, and they chose to do what they did. But let's talk a little bit about, Josh, about the actual ordinance itself. I have it up here on my computer, and as we talked, they're basically it's a situation where there's nothing in this law that meets the due process requirements of a hearing, which puts the burden of proof on the government to prove the dog is in fact a pit bull. So what we have here is, and they don't even spell the Staffordshire Terrier right. They have American Stafford Terrier breed.
Yeah.
And of course they have the always unenforceable language that says, which contains as an element, which, as we know from Grant County, can mean 1%, which then brings into question enforcement and whether or not 1% has a rational basis for the public safety.
We tried to get answers in regards to that, like in specifics, what percentage validates whether a dog is or isn't. We got no response. We tried to get details, as many details as possible in regards to the identification process, and there really doesn't seem like there is one. And, this ordinance paper, 921, anybody can pull it up for Riverside County, kind of full of just, it's a really badly written thing. I would point people to Section 2, purpose, and just that sentence alone is pretty comical. It says, to protect the public's health and welfare from irresponsible owners of pit bulls by mitigating the overpopulation of unwanted pit bulls. So they're talking about the irresponsible owners, but yet their response has nothing to do with the irresponsible owners.
Well, I think actually it's funny. This particular post got a lot of debate on our page about there are many people that think, well, what's wrong with mandatory spay-neuter? All dogs should be spay-neutered. My point to this as a lawyer is that regardless of what the outcome of mandatory spay-neuter is, whether it's good, bad, all that, the point is this law is unconstitutional. And imagine that you were driving in your car and a policeman pulled you over and said, okay, I'm giving you a ticket. And now that I've given you a ticket, there's an irrebuttable presumption that you were speeding. And the only way that you can appeal this is to appeal it. And now the burden is on you to prove that you weren't speeding. Can you imagine that situation? That's what this law says.
It's exactly what this document says. Literally, it says they will schedule a breed determination appointment and determine whether a dog is a pit bull, which essentially means, and I've read their documentation, that means that it's either the dog's either coming in with an already given title, or it will go to a selected veterinarian from Riverside County, and they will make the determination. And then, based on that determination, that is the evidence of facts stated therein. And then basically on an appeal, dog owner has to, he has the burden to show that the dog is not a pit bull, which is the exact opposite of how America is supposed to function.
Exactly.
The dog is guilty and you have to prove its innocence, which is totally, ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't see how a city attorney could look at this and say, this is constitutional, because the way it works under Matthews versus Eldridge, which is a Supreme Court case, is that if somebody takes your property, you have to have a swift hearing within, a certain amount of time. Swift varies depending on the property interest involved, but the government has to come forward and say, okay, here's why we had the right to do what we did, and put on evidence where they have the burden of proof. So, in other words, if they were to, if they don't come forward, you walk, because they have the burden. Here, they don't even have this hearing. They don't have a hearing where their veterinarian comes in and says, okay, I say it's a pit bull, and you come in and you say, no, I've got DNA, or I have a vet, or I've got whatever I've got, and then somebody decides which of one of those positions is correct. That's what's supposed to happen.
You'll really enjoy because at the end of the hearing, after the public comments were given, based on my comment and another person's comment, we both asked about the identification process pretty much in detail. So after the public comments were over, they kind of threw it back to Robert Miller and his selected veterinarian that he brought in. They were basically the ones presenting it as representatives from the county. So they threw it back to them to kind of break down the identification process, which they didn't break down at all, but some of the things that they said while attempting to kind of justify their actions. And I have video of all this, so if anybody wants to watch it,
I want to watch it. I want to watch it. Send me a copy.
And it'll definitely be on my YouTube page within a day or two.
I mean, I don't think a veterinarian's qualified to say what breed a dog is by looking at it. And I would love to cross-examine that veterinarian, because now you're running into the question of conflict of interest. If the city or the county or whatever this is hiring him, he has a sort of internal conflict.
Here's two of the things that he said that I can remember off the top of my head. He straight out said, and this is coming from the vet, he said that he can look at a dog and tell if it's a pit bull versus a Staffordshire Terrier. There's a clear visual difference, and he can tell the difference every single time. But the crazier thing that he said is, he said, identifying dogs is sort of like watching porn. You know what you're looking at.
Oh my God!
If you're watching it, you know what it is. And
you know it when you see it. That's what one of the Supreme Court guys said.
Yeah, that's exactly what he said, and he literally used that
analogy
example.
Yeah.
And I me and my friend who were there literally laughed out loud, and we got in trouble because I was standing right next to a cop. But I mean, that's crazy. That's
Well, the problem with it, when you see it, is there's no objective way to measure it, which is what they had. That's the problem they had with trying to define pornography, was because it was so subjective that if 5 people looked at it, they would all have a different opinion. And then when you add in with it has material social value and all this other stuff, the problem is that how do you have a nationwide distribution of a film like Carnal Knowledge when Alabama says it's porn? I mean, what, do you make a different version for every state or every city or every county?
It was very pompous of him to basically say that he can look at any, situational dog that comes in and basically tell me or you or whoever what that dog is. I mean,
Well, I think we should bring in Victoria Voigt to talk about that with him, and some other people that are involved.
Yeah, and I brought that up during my public comment. I brought her study up, and there was also another person there that gave a public comment that was involved in the formulation of that study with Victoria, and it's as if our comments didn't even happen, man. They didn't even respond to it, but they did. When a woman did bring up numbers from Colleen Lynn and dogsbite.org, they dropped the pit bulls are less than 5% of the population, yet they account for 65 whatever plus fatalities or whatever type of nonsense that she spews on her website. They gravitated towards that information, and they held it up maybe 3 or 4 different times during their final talk before voting, and then the votes came through, bam, 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 5-0. And but they didn't address anything that the other side said, basically.
Well, this is very common. I mean, when we looked at the Grant County historical stuff about what they looked at before they passed their breed discriminatory legislation there, they had all the stuff. They had the Colleen Lynn stuff. They had the CDC stuff. They had all the stuff they needed. But they had their opinions, and that's all they considered. They said, this is what we're going to do, and that's it.
Yeah,
so
that's a vibe I definitely got. I mean, I knew going in that, best case scenario, the vote's probably going to be 4-1. I mean, I could tell by watching the hearing in April that there was one supervisor that was kind of constitutionally engaged from a property rights standpoint, so he could probably be talked to and would make some sense, but they definitely had their minds made up prior, because it was literally as if we weren't even there, and Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about my disappointment and yours in the advocacy community for not even showing up to this thing and showing support. There's a huge disconnect between liking a page, talking about something, and actually getting in your car, going down there and saying something to these people.
Yeah, I specifically put out on my page, having access to Facebook and kind of that network, you're able to create events and kind of let people know what's going on that way. So I created one for this. Going into today, I had like 50 people going, and then when you think, well, maybe half those people will show up. I got there and I knew like one person, and the majority of the people that were speaking out were breeders. And half of those breeders actually supported the legislation because they were written in as the legislation not applying to them. So they were
exempt.
And they were fine to throw the dogs under the bus so long as they were exempt, basically. But back to the advocacy community and the rescuers, it is pretty wild because I know you mentioned earlier that, spay and neuter issue is kind of a conflicting thing, and when you do it to all breeds versus mandating breeds or whatever. But the point I would want to drive home is if you're familiar with this Riverside case and many cases like it, they start out, it's clear just to read the 921 document. It states in there numerous times that pit bulls are a detriment to public safety. It's implied that they're dangerous, different than other dogs. So these things start out as a vilification process of the pit bull, and then when they realize they can't ban them due to California state law, this is where they end up.
Right.
And this is also what people like Colleen and, others like her are also out publicizing.
It's their fallback position. Yeah, it's their fallback position.
This is less nasty. They can kind of play the part of, well, it's an overpopulation position, so why wouldn't you want to spay? And when we all know Colleen wants pit bulls dead. So pit bull advocates have to realize that the dog, the breed, the type, the numerous types that get called pit bulls, they're under the gun right now, and this is where it's ending up. And yes, spay and neuter is a good thing, but you got to understand the targeting aspect of this, which is where it starts. Look back. I have the entire hearing from April on my YouTube page. I ripped it off the internet, so you can go back and watch that. You can listen how these council members are talking about pit bulls, and they are extremely nasty. The manager of the Riverside County shelter is a fool, and there's all kinds of statements that they're implying, sometimes outright saying, these dogs are different, these dogs are vicious, these dogs bite like sharks. Robert Miller in April said, pit bulls by and large can jump up into a tree and hang there for 2 hours. Just some of the most ridiculous tales imaginable, they just throw out repeatedly. So
what I'm hoping is that we can find someone to file a lawsuit, just as they did in this other case that we were working on last week, because this thing does not. No judge would say that the way they've written this meets due process in terms of a hearing and a swift hearing and an ability to have to require the government to come forward and prove their case. If somebody comes and says you have a pit bull, you have the right to say, prove it. I'm not saying anything further. And then the burden's on them. And if they can't prove it, then your dog is not guilty.